They called it a wedding, they called it tradition, they called it honor. But for one woman, it was a life stolen in silence. She did not walk down the aisle as herself. She spoke vows meant for another name. And the man waiting at the altar was never meant to be hers. This is not a love story. It is a story of obedience, fear, and survival. And of a woman who disappeared so another could live freely. Before we get started, tell us in the comments where you watching from and what time it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss a chilling story. Stay with us until the end. And when this story concludes, leave a comment telling us how intense it felt, because what you were about to hear is not a tale of romance or tradition as it is often told, but a quiet account of how a life can be redirected without a single question being asked of the person who must live it. In the village where this story begins, weddings were not celebrated as unions between two individuals but recorded as transactions between families stitched together with promises older than memory. Names carried the weight of land, lineage, and obligation. Choices were spoken of only after decisions had already been made, and silence was considered a virtue when it served stability. Girls grew up learning the language of acceptance, early how to lower their eyes when elders spoke, how to smile when praised, how to step aside when another's future required room. From childhood, the sisters understood these rules without ever having them explained. One sister learned how to be visible, how to stand where eyes naturally landed, how to speak with a softness that invited approval. The other learned how to adjust, how to listen more than she spoke, how to sense what was needed and become it without drawing attention. They were close in age but shaped differently by expectation, not by temperament alone, but by the subtle instructions woven into every gesture and correction. Their home was orderly and restrained, a place where affection existed but was rarely expressed openly, where duty was praised more loudly than desire. From the time they could walk, they were reminded that family honor was fragile, something that could be cracked by a single misstep. Reputation was discussed as if it were a living thing, requiring constant care. The girls absorbed this lesson the way children absorb gravity, without question, without resistance. They did not yet know how heavy it would become. When the proposal arrived, it came not with excitement but with relief. The groom's family was respected, their land fertile, their influence steady. Such matches were seen as protection against uncertainty. The younger sister's name was spoken first, not because she was asked, but because she fit the image required. She was praised for her calmness, her grace, the way she seemed to belong naturally in spaces where others grew nervous. The older sister stood beside her, congratulated politely, already sensing her own role receding into the background. This was the order of things, and order, she had been taught, was safety. Preparations began immediately. Dates were set, messages exchanged, expectations aligned. There was little room for delay, because delay invited scrutiny, and scrutiny invited gossip. The sisters moved through these early weeks together, sharing quiet glances and unspoken understanding. The younger one appeared composed, but beneath that composure lay tension. The older one noticed it first, not because she was more perceptive, but because she had learned to watch carefully. She saw the hesitation in her sister's movements, the way her hands lingered when folding clothes, the pauses before answering questions. Something was wrong, though no one said it aloud. In this village, problems were rarely addressed directly. They were managed, adjusted, redirected. When the issue finally surfaced, it did not arrive as an expiation but as a conclusion. The younger sister could no longer proceed. The reason was never announced publicly. It did not need to be. The mere fact of withdrawal was enough to set speculation in motion, and speculation was dangerous. The families gathered, voices low, faces composed. Options were considered quickly, efficiently, without sentiment. Breaking the arrangement was unthinkable. Returning gifts would signal failure. Apologies would not restore balance. The groom's family had already invested expectation. To disrupt that would be to invite lasting consequences. That was when the solution was offered, spoken as if it were obvious, as if it required no justification beyond necessity. The older sister would take her place. She was of the same blood, close enough in age, familiar enough in face. With the right instruction, the difference could be smoothed away. The ceremony could proceed. The agreement would hold. The village would remain undisturbed. The decision was framed as sacrifice, as loyalty, as love. It was never framed as theft. No one asked her how she felt. No one asked whether she consented. The language used around her was careful, heavy with implication. She was told she was strong enough. She was told she was needed. She was told that family depended on her. Each statement carried an expectation disguised as praise. To refuse would not merely be disobedient, it would be selfish. And selfishness, in a place that valued collective survival above individual truth, was unforgivable. In the days that followed, her life shifted abruptly, though outwardly little changed. She still woke in the same house, ate the same meals, moved through the same rooms. Yet everything felt altered, as if the ground beneath her had tilted slightly, imperceptibly, but enough to change her balance. Instructions replaced conversation. Corrections replaced affection. She was taught how to stand, how to speak, how to answer questions meant for someone else. Her gestures were observed, adjusted, rehearsed. Her sister, as preferences were recited as facts she needed to memorize. Laughter was discouraged if it did not match the expected tone. Silence was praised when it concealed uncertainty. At night, when the house grew quiet, she lay awake replaying the day, as lessons, afraid that a forgotten detail might betray her. She wondered how easily a person could be rewritten, how many repetitions it took before a life felt natural. She thought of her own name, the sound of it, the way it felt to be called by it. No one said she could not use it anymore, but no one did. Its absence was gradual, polite, almost gentle. That she would later understand was what made it so effective. The younger sister moved through the house like a shadow, present but separate, relieved and ashamed in equal measure. Their conversations became brief, guarded. Gratitude hovered between them, heavy and unspoken. The older sister did not resent her, not yet. She understood fear. She understood the relief of escape. What unsettled her was how quickly the world adjusted, how easily everyone accepted substitution as solution. It made her wonder how many lives had been rearranged this way before, without leaving a trace. As the wedding day approached, the pace quickened. There was no time for doubt. The dress was fitted to her body, altered slightly to create the illusion of familiarity. Jewelry was placed around her neck, its weight unfamiliar, its significance borrowed. Elders offered advice that sounded like blessing but felt like instruction. She listened, nodded, complied. Inside, she focused on breathing, on maintaining the composure she had been taught was her greatest asset. Panic would be noticed, calm would be rewarded. On the morning of the ceremony, she stood alone for a moment, staring at her reflection. The face looking back at her was her own, but the meaning attached to it had changed. She was no longer being presented as herself. She was being presented as continuity, as resolution, as silence made flesh. She adjusted the fabric at her shoulders, smoothed her hair, and practiced the expression she had been instructed to wear: soft, agreeable, unremarkable. The mirror did not argue. It simply reflected. Outside, the village prepared as it always did. Music drifted through the air. Neighbors gathered, eager to witness an event that confirmed order. The groom waited, confident in the certainty of what had been promised to him. He did not question the substitution, or if he noticed, he chose not to see. In arrangements like this, clarity was less valuable than completion. The ceremony mattered more than the truth behind it. As she stepped forward, guided by hands that felt both familiar and distant, she felt a strange separation occur, as if part of her were observing from elsewhere. This distance protected her. It allowed her to move, to speak, to smile, without collapsing under the weight of what was happening. She understood then that survival sometimes required division, a splitting of self that could endure what a whole could not. The vows were spoken, words heavy with permanence. She repeated them carefully, aware that each syllable bound her more tightly to a future she had not chosen. The applause that followed felt muffled, distant. People smiled, satisfied. The agreement had been fulfilled, order restored. No one looked closely enough to see what had been lost. That night, when celebration gave way to quiet, she sat alone for a brief moment, the weight of the day settling into her bones. She realized that the deception was only beginning. Acting as her sister, as bride, was not a single performance but a lifelong role. There would be no curtain call, no return to herself waiting backstage. The life she had known had ended not with a farewell, but with a substitution so seamless that few would ever question it. And in that realization lay the first true understanding of her fate, that her disappearance would not be marked by absence but by presence. She would be seen every day, spoken to, relied upon, and yet never recognized as who she truly was. This was not a story of rebellion or escape. It was the beginning of a quieter endurance, one shaped by obedience, fear, and a strength no one ever asked whether she possessed. What makes this beginning chilling is not its drama, but its normalcy. Nothing about the decision seemed extraordinary to those who made it. That is how such stories survive, by hiding inside tradition, by disguising coercion as duty, by teaching women that silence is the highest form of loyalty. And as this story moves forward, it will reveal not a single act of cruelty, but a series of reasonable choices that together built a life from which there was no honest exit. After the vows were spoken and the crowd dispersed, the house that awaited her did not feel new so much as it felt sealed. It was familiar in structure, yet foreign in expectation, every room carrying rules she had not helped write. The threshold she crossed that night was not simply the entrance to a marriage, but the closing of a door behind her, one that led back to the life where her name had meaning. Inside these walls, she would be addressed differently, expected to respond without hesitation, and measured against memories that were not her own. Even the silence felt prescribed, as if the air itself understood what was required of her. The first days passed in a blur of observation. She watched how the household moved, how servants lowered their eyes, how conversations unfolded around her without ever truly including her. She listened more than she spoke, careful not to introduce unfamiliar rhythms into routines that predated her arrival. Each interaction required calculation. A pause held too long might suggest hesitation. An answer given too quickly might reveal unfamiliarity. She learned to mirror rather than initiate, to respond rather than assert. This strategy kept suspicion at bay, but it came at a cost. With every successful imitation, a small part of her own spontaneity fell away. Her husband addressed her gently, with the confidence of someone who believed he knew her well. He spoke of shared memories she did not possess, of conversations that had never happened, of preferences she had never expressed. Each time, she nodded, smiled, adjusted. Correction was impossible without unraveling everything. Silence became her refuge, though even silence had to be calibrated. Too much withdrawal could be read as discontent. Too little could invite intimacy she was not prepared to navigate. She existed in a narrow corridor of acceptable behavior, where every step required balance. At night, when the household settled into rest, she lay awake tracing the contours of her new reality. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the weight of vigilance. Dreams blurred past and present, merging her sister, imagined life with her own memories. She woke often unsure of where she was, only to remember quickly, sharply, the role she now inhabited. Morning brought renewed performance. There was no rehearsal period, no allowance for error. The expectation of continuity was absolute. Letters arrived from relatives and neighbors, all addressed to the name she now wore like borrowed clothing. She learned to read them carefully, searching for cues about relationships she was expected to maintain. Replies were crafted with caution, echoing tones she believed appropriate. She avoided personal details, favoring polite generalities that revealed nothing specific. This vagueness protected her, but it also isolated her further. Each letter sent reinforced the distance between who she was and who she was required to be. Her sister, absence hovered like an unspoken presence. Rarely mentioned, she became a negative space in conversation, defined by what was not said. When she did appear in speech, it was as someone who had chosen a different path, someone whose future was no longer tied to this household. The implication was clear. The exchange had been successful. One life freed, another bound. The older sister absorbed this understanding quietly, resisting the urge to resent. Resentment, she knew, would only deepen her isolation. Instead, she focused on endurance, on maintaining the delicate equilibrium that kept the truth concealed. As weeks turned into months, the initial intensity of scrutiny softened slightly. Familiarity bred complacency. Small inconsistencies went unnoticed as routine took hold. This easing did not bring relief so much as it brought exhaustion. Constant vigilance had carved deep channels in her mind, and even as the pressure lessened, the habit remained. She found it difficult to relax, to act without considering consequence. Her body carried tension she could not release, a readiness for correction that never quite faded. Household responsibilities expanded. She was expected to oversee tasks, manage resources, maintain appearances. These duties offered a strange form of agency, limited, conditional, but tangible. She performed them diligently, earning quiet approval. Praise came in measured doses, reinforcing compliance without encouraging independence. She learned quickly which initiatives were welcomed and which were not. Efficiency was valued, curiosity was not. This distinction shaped how she engaged with her new role, encouraging precision over exploration. Social gatherings tested her resolve. In the presence of extended family and neighbors, she was expected to embody warmth and familiarity. Conversations drifted toward shared histories, anecdotes repeated with affectionate certainty. She listened carefully, filing away details that might be useful later. When prompted to contribute, she offered responses that affirmed rather than expanded, careful not to introduce contradictions. Each successful exchange felt like a small victory, but the accumulation of such victories was draining. Survival, she discovered, could be more tiring than resistance. In moments of solitude, she reflected on the nature of identity. How much of it, she wondered, was internal, and how much was shaped by recognition. If everyone around her believed she was someone else, did that belief alter reality in some fundamental way? She clung to private rituals as anchors, silent repetitions of her true name, memories revisited in detail, sensations recalled with deliberate focus. These acts did not change her circumstances, but they preserved continuity within her, a thread connecting past to present. Her relationship with her husband settled into a pattern defined by courtesy and distance. He interpreted her reserve through familiar frameworks, attributing it to temperament rather than deception. In doing so, he unknowingly contributed to the stability of the lie. She recognized this dynamic with a mixture of relief and unease. His assumptions shielded her, but they also erased the possibility of genuine understanding. She wondered at times whether the truth would matter to him at all, or whether it would simply be another inconvenience to manage. The broader community reinforced this erasure. Neighbors spoke of her as if they had always known her, their confidence unshaken by subtle differences. Collective memory, she realized, was flexible when convenience demanded it. People remembered what supported the narrative they needed. This realization was both chilling and instructive. It taught her that truth in this context was less powerful than consensus. As long as enough people agreed on a version of events, that version became reality. This understanding influenced how she perceived her own endurance. She was not merely surviving an individual deception, she was participating in a collective one. The weight of that participation pressed on her conscience. Though she knew refusal would have brought consequences she could not bear, she learned to compartmentalize, separating moral judgment from practical necessity. This separation was not clean. It left residue, a dull ache that surfaced in quiet moments. As time progressed, the expectation of children emerged, first as suggestion, then as assumption. This prospect filled her with conflicting emotions. She feared the permanence it represented, the way it would bind her irrevocably to this life. At the same time, she sensed that motherhood might offer a form of authenticity unavailable elsewhere, a relationship not mediated by borrowed identity. This tension remained unresolved, hovering at the edge of her thoughts. Throughout this period, she noticed how her own voice changed, not just in pitch or phrasing, but in confidence. Speaking less, she thought less aloud. Thoughts remained internal, untested by dialogue. This inward turn sharpened her self-awareness, but narrowed her external presence. She became adept at observation, less practiced at expression. The world saw a composed woman. Inside, she carried a dense, unspoken narrative. What sustained her most was the recognition that her endurance served a purpose, however unjust. It protected her sister, preserved family stability, avoided scandal. These justifications were repeated often, sometimes aloud, sometimes only in her mind. They did not make the situation fair, but they made it intelligible. Intelligibility, she learned, was a form of coping. It allowed her to locate herself within a web of cause and effect, rather than drifting in incomprehensible loss. Yet even as she accepted these rationalizations, she sensed their fragility. They depended on silence, on the continued cooperation of many people. Any disruption, a careless word, an unexpected question could unravel everything. This awareness kept her vigilant, even as routine lulled others into comfort. She lived with the constant knowledge that her life rested on a shared refusal to look too closely. This phase of her life, defined by adjustment and concealment, reshaped her understanding of power. Power, she realized, did not always announce itself through force. Often it operated through expectation, through the quiet insistence that certain roles be filled regardless of who filled them. She had been selected not for who she was, but for how easily she could be made to fit. That realization cut deeply, but it also clarified the nature of what she faced. She was not valued as an individual. She was valued as a solution. Understanding this did not free her, but it gave her a language for her experience. It allowed her to see her suffering not as personal failure, but as the consequence of a system that prioritized order over truth. This perspective, though painful, offered a measure of dignity. She was not invisible because she lacked worth. She was invisible because visibility would have disrupted a carefully maintained balance. As the months accumulated into years, the urgency of the initial discussion faded into a quieter, more enduring challenge: how to live authentically within inauthentic circumstances. This challenge did not have a clear answer. It required constant negotiation, small adjustments, moments of compromise followed by moments of resolve. Her life became a series of calculated choices, each weighed against potential cost. And through it all, one truth remained constant. Though rarely acknowledged, the marriage that had begun as a substitution had become a life in its own right, shaped by endurance rather than choice. The woman who entered it under another's name was changing not into a sister, but into someone forged by silence, vigilance, and an unyielding will to survive. This transformation, gradual and uncelebrated, marked the true beginning of her story, not as a bride, but as a witness to the quiet ways lives can be rewritten without leaving visible scars. As the rhythm of her days settled into something resembling normality, a different kind of strain began to surface, one that did not announce itself through crisis, but accumulated quietly, layer by layer. The vigilance that had once felt urgent now felt endless. There was no milestone after which she could relax, no moment when the deception would be considered complete. Instead, each day renewed the obligation to perform, to remember, to anticipate. The marriage had not concluded with the ceremony, it had only begun there, extending indefinitely into the future with no provision for rest. She noticed how memory itself became a site of labor. She had to remember what she had already claimed to remember, which stories she had affirmed, which details she had nodded through, which events she had silently accepted as her own. Forgetting posed a danger equal to revelation. A misplaced hesitation, a confused expression at the wrong moment, could invite question. Questions led to scrutiny. Scrutiny threatened collapse. And so she learned to curate her own recall, to build a parallel memory that could function convincingly alongside her true one. This effort altered her relationship to time. Past, present, and future blurred together, organized not by chronology but by risk. She evaluated moments not by their emotional significance, but by their potential to expose or conceal. Even joy was filtered through this lens. When she felt happiness at a successful gathering, at a moment of quiet companionship, she questioned it immediately. Was this feeling safe? Did it betray something she was not supposed to possess? Could happiness itself arouse suspicion? Her husband, observing her composure, mistook it for stability. He spoke proudly of her to others, praising her reliability, her restraint. These qualities were admired not because they reflected her inner life, but because they supported the householder's image. She became aware that she was being evaluated constantly, not as a person, but as a role. Success meant invisibility. Failure meant disruption. The paradox of her existence sharpened. The better she performed, the less she existed as herself. Social rituals intensified this paradox. Festivals, visits, ceremonies each demanded participation, presence, affirmation. She moved through these events with practiced ease, exchanging greetings, accepting compliments, offering polite responses. The repetition of these interactions dulled their edges, but it did not remove their weight. Each encounter required her to inhabit a version of herself, shaped entirely by others' expectations. Over time, the effort of sustaining that version began to eclipse the memory of who she had been before. This erosion frightened her more than the deception itself. Lies, she had learned, could be maintained with effort. Identity once loosened was harder to reclaim. She guarded against this loss by cultivating interiority. Inwardly, she narrated her days in her own voice, naming experiences as she understood them rather than as they appeared. This private narration became an act of resistance, a way of asserting authorship over a life she could not openly claim. In moments alone, she allowed herself to feel anger not explosive, but dense and steady. Anger at the ease with which her consent had been bypassed. Anger at the structures that had made such bypassing seem reasonable. Anger at herself for adapting so effectively that no one felt compelled to question the arrangement. This anger did not seek expression. It sought understanding. She examined it carefully, tracing its origins, recognizing its legitimacy without letting it consume her. In this way, anger became another form of awareness rather than a threat to stability. Her sister, as continued freedom remained a complicated presence in her thoughts. She received occasional updates, delivered casually, as if the matter had resolved itself completely. Each mention carried a dual meaning, confirmation that the sacrifice had achieved its purpose, and reminder that the burden of that sacrifice remained hers alone. She did not begrudge her sister's escape. She begrudged the silence that had made it possible, the silence that demanded her compliance while absolving others of responsibility. As years progressed, subtle shifts occur within the household. Familiarity bred predictability. Predictability bred a loosening of scrutiny. This easing created small openings, moments when she could act without immediate calculation. She lingered a second longer over a book. She allowed a spontaneous laugh to escape. These moments felt both liberating and dangerous, reminders of how tightly she had been holding herself. She measured each one afterward, assessing whether it had registered as deviation. Most passed unnoticed. The world, she realized, was less attentive than she had feared. It was content as long as surfaces remained smooth. This realization did not bring relief so much as melancholy. It suggested that the performance had become unnecessary, not because the truth would be accepted, but because no one was invested enough to care. Her identity had been absorbed into the role so completely that its origins no longer mattered. She was not protected by vigilance anymore. She was protected by indifference. The village had moved on. The marriage was old news. Stability had been achieved. Her inner turmoil was irrelevant. She began to see how indifference functioned as a powerful stabilizer. Outrage might have forced confrontation. Curiosity might have uncovered truth. Indifference allowed everything to continue unchanged. This insight altered her understanding of injustice. It was not always enforced by cruelty. Often, it persisted because no one felt compelled to intervene. Comfort maintained itself by ignoring what lay beneath. Within this environment, her sense of self adapted further. She no longer thought of herself as pretending to be her sister. That framing suggested a temporary masquerade, a role that might someday end. Instead, she began to understand herself as living between identities belonging fully to neither. Her sister, as name clung to her publicly. Her own existed only in memory. She occupied a space that was functionally invisible, defined by service rather than recognition. This in-between state reshaped her relationships. With servants, she maintained a distance that discouraged familiarity. With neighbors, she upheld politeness without intimacy. With her husband, she offered reliability without surrender. Each relationship was calibrated to minimize exposure. Trust, she learned, was not a universal good. In her circumstances, it could be dangerous. She trusted selectively, cautiously aware that shared truth carried risk. The arrival of children intensified this careful calibration. Pregnancy anchored her more firmly to the life she had entered under false pretenses. The physical changes were undeniable, grounding her in the present even as they tied her future more tightly to this household. She experienced pregnancy not as fulfillment, but as inevitability. Her body became another site where choice had been overridden by expectation. Yet when the child was born and placed in her arms, something shifted. Motherhood introduced a relationship that did not depend on performance. The child did not care about names or narratives. The child responded to presence, to touch, to voice. In this bond, she felt a form of authenticity she had not experienced since before the wedding. Loving the child did not require deception. It required attention. This realization complicated her emotional landscape. It introduced tenderness into a life shaped by restraint. At the same time, motherhood deepened her fear of exposure. The child represented continuity, inheritance. What would be passed on? Which name would be taught? Which stories would be told? She understood that the lie she lived could not remain contained forever. It would extend into the next generation, shaping their understanding of identity and belonging. This awareness weighed heavily on her, forcing her to consider not only her own survival, but the moral implications of perpetuating silence. She began to imagine futures in which the truth might surface accidentally, a slip of language, a forgotten detail, a relative as careless remark. She rehearsed responses in her mind, contingencies layered upon contingencies. Each imagined scenario ended the same way. Exposure would not free her. It would simply redistribute blame. She would be questioned. Her sister would be implicated. Her children would be marked. The cost of truth seemed unbearably high. This calculation reinforced her commitment to endurance. Endurance, she realized, was not passive. It was active, demanding constant adjustment. It required foresight, emotional regulation, and strategic silence. She did not romanticize this endurance. She experienced it as labor unrecognized, uncompensated, essential to maintaining a fragile peace. Over time, she noticed changes in how she perceived other women around her. She recognized similar patterns of accommodation, similar compromises hidden behind composure. Conversations with them took on new layers of meaning. Words were chosen carefully. Silences spoke volumes. In shared glances, she sensed recognition, though no one ever articulated it directly. These women did not need to know her secret to understand her predicament. They had their own. This unspoken solidarity offered a muted form of comfort. It reminded her that she was not uniquely burdened, that her experience was part of a broader pattern. At the same time, it underscored the scale of the problem. If so many women were living lives shaped by unchosen roles, how deeply entrenched were the structures that demanded such adaptation? This question lingered, heavy and unresolved. Her inner narration grew more reflective. She began to analyze her own compliance, not as weakness, but as strategy shaped by constraint. She acknowledged moments when she had chosen the path of least resistance, not because it was right, but because alternatives were worse. This honesty allowed her to forgive herself for choices that had once felt like failures. Survival, she came to understand, often requires morally complex decisions. As her children grew, she faced new challenges. They asked questions, innocent and persistent. Why certain customs existed, why certain stories were told the way they were. She answered carefully, offering truths that did not reveal the central deception but encouraged critical thought. She wanted them to learn awareness without burdening them with knowledge that could harm them. This balancing act mirrored her own life, requiring discernment and restraint. She took solace in small acts of agency, choosing how to raise her children, choosing which traditions to emphasize and which to soften, choosing kindness where rigidity was expected. These choices did not dismantle the system that had constrained her, but they allowed her to shape its impact. Through them, she asserted a measure of authorship over a life largely defined by others. As the years accumulated, the initial shock of her situation receded, replaced by a steadier, more enduring tension. She no longer woke each day fearing immediate exposure. Instead, she carried a low, constant awareness of the lie as permanence. This awareness shaped her priorities, narrowing her focus to what mattered most, protecting her children, maintaining stability, preserving a sense of self beneath layers of accommodation. The woman she had been before the wedding felt distant, like a memory belonging to someone else. Yet she resisted the notion that she had disappeared entirely. She believed instead that she had been compressed, forced into a smaller space within herself. That space remained intact, though rarely acknowledged. It held her true name, her unaltered memories, her private judgments. It was not expansive, but it was resilient. This resilience did not announce itself through rebellion. It expressed itself through continuity, through waking each day and choosing to proceed, through maintaining clarity where confusion would have been easier, through refusing to internalize the lie as truth, even when living it required cooperation. In this way, she preserved a distinction between circumstance and identity, however fragile. As this phase of her life unfolded, it became clear that the most profound transformation she had undergone was not from sister to bride, but from person to role. This transformation was subtle, cumulative, and rarely acknowledged. It did not strip her of humanity, but it demanded that she negotiated constantly. The cost of that negotiation was ongoing, shaping her thoughts, her relationships, her sense of time. What emerges from this stretch of her story is not a dramatic turning point, but a deepening of the conditions established at the beginning. The deception had taken root. The life built upon it had grown complex and entangled. Escape was no longer imaginable without immense harm. Endurance, therefore, became not just a response, but a way of being. And in that endurance lay the quiet tragedy of her existence, not the absence of love or competence, but the absence of choice. Choice had been removed so thoroughly, so early, that its loss became almost invisible, almost, but not entirely, For within her the awareness of that loss remained sharp, a silent witness to what had been taken and to the strength required to live without ever naming it aloud. As endurance settled into the marrow of her days, she began to recognize how thoroughly the lie had reorganized her inner landscape. It was no longer a matter of remembering what to say or how to behave. It was a matter of how she perceived herself in relation to the world. The vigilance that once felt like a series of deliberate choices now operated automatically, shaping her reactions before she had time to consider alternatives. She would sense danger in a pause, interpret curiosity as threat, weigh affection for its potential cost. These habits had grown roots. They were not easily removed, even in moments that appeared safe. Her children grew quickly, each stage introducing new demands and new risks. As they learned to speak, she listened closely to their questions, anticipating where innocence might wander into dangerous territory. Children ask without agenda, without understanding the consequences of inquiry. Their curiosity felt like sunlight, warming and illuminating, but also exposing. She responded with patience, redirecting when necessary, offering explanations that satisfied without revealing. This practice sharpened her ability to speak in layers, to communicate truth without naming it, to guide understanding without opening forbidden doors. She hated this necessity even as she mastered it. The household expanded and contracted with the seasons. Relatives visited, guests stayed, new servants arrived, others departed. Each change required recalibration. New eyes meant renewed caution. New voices meant new interpretations of her behavior. She learned to observe first, to map personalities quickly, to identify who asked questions and who accepted surfaces. This skill became second nature. It allowed her to navigate shifting dynamics without incident, but it also deepened her sense of isolation. Relationships, she realized, were not built on mutual discovery but on managed impressions. Her husband's expectations evolved as well. Early assumptions hardened into habits. He no longer spoke of shared memories. He spoke of routine, of responsibility, of the future they were building. He relied on her competence, her steadiness, her apparent contentment. In his mind, the marriage had become what marriages were supposed to become: predictable, stable, unremarkable. This predictability protected her, yet it also erased any possibility of recognition beyond function. She was valued, but only insofar as she fulfilled the role assigned to her. Desire, curiosity, and genuine interest had faded into background noise. She noticed how often people spoke around her rather than to her. Decisions were discussed in her presence, assumptions made about her agreement. When she did offer an opinion, it was acknowledged politely, then weighed against other considerations that mattered more. Over time, she adjusted her expectations. She spoke when necessary, listened when not. She learned which contributions would be welcomed and which would be quietly ignored. This adaptation did not extinguish her intelligence. It redirected it inward, where analysis continued unchecked by social limitation. The inner narration she had cultivated became more sophisticated. She began to think of her life in terms of patterns rather than events, observing cycles of pressure and release, scrutiny and neglect. She recognized how crises created opportunities for change, while stability entrenched the status quo. In her circumstances, stability was prized above all else. It was the currency that justified every compromise. Stability excused the lie. Stability demanded her silence. Stability, she understood, was not neutral. It was maintained at her expense. This realization sharpened her understanding of power. Power, she saw, did not always reside with those who issued commands. It often resided with those who defined what counted as disruption. Anything that threatened stability was labeled dangerous, irresponsible, immoral. By that measure, her truth was not merely inconvenient, it was subversive. Naming it would not restore balance, it would shatter it. And so the system framed her silence as virtue, her endurance as strength, her compliance as maturity. The language used to describe her adaptation transformed coercion into character. She became acutely aware of how language shaped reality. Words like sacrifice and duty circulated freely, carrying praise without accountability. When people spoke of her generosity, she recognized the mechanism at work. By praising her willingness to give up her life, they absolved themselves of responsibility for taking it. This insight did not provoke confrontation, it provoked clarity. She learned to listen not for what was said, but for what language made acceptable. In quiet moments, she wondered what would happen if she stopped performing even small aspects of the role. If she answered a question honestly instead of safely, if she corrected a mistaken assumption. The imagined outcomes varied, but none offered liberation. At best, she would be dismissed as difficult, ungrateful, unstable. At worst, she would trigger consequences that would ripple outward, harming those she loved most. These imaginings reinforced her understanding that choice, once removed, does not reappear easily. It must be actively restored, and restoration requires power she did not possess. Her relationship with other women deepened subtly over time. Without sharing specifics, they exchanged experiences of constraint and adaptation. They spoke of expectations placed upon them, of choices made on their behalf, of the careful navigation required to survive. These conversations were coded, their meanings layered beneath everyday language. They offered recognition without exposure. In these exchanges, she felt less alone. She also felt the weight of collective silence, the knowledge that many lives were shaped by similar forces, each story folded inward to protect the fragile equilibrium of the whole. As her children grew older, they began to notice inconsistencies in the world around them. They asked why certain rules applied differently to different people, why some questions were discouraged, why some paths were closed without explanation. She encouraged their curiosity cautiously, teaching them to observe without immediately challenging, to understand systems before resisting them. She wanted them to be aware without being reckless. This balance was difficult. She feared that by teaching them caution, she might be perpetuating the very constraints she resented. Yet she also feared that untempered honesty could expose them to harm. Her children's emerging identities complicated her own. Through them, she saw possibilities she had never been allowed to explore. She felt pride in their curiosity, their resilience, their capacity for empathy. She also felt grief, knowing that the foundation of their lives rested on a lie she could not dismantle. She carried this contradiction quietly, refusing to let it curdle into bitterness. Love, she reminded herself, could exist alongside injustice. One did not negate the other. Time altered her relationship with memory. Certain details of her former life began to blur, not from neglect, but from disuse. Faces faded. Places lost sharpness. The sound of her own name, once vivid, became faint. She resisted this erosion actively, revisiting memories deliberately, anchoring them through repetition. She told herself stories of her childhood in precise detail, recalling smells, textures, sounds. These acts of remembrance were not indulgence. They were preservation. They ensured that something of her original self remained intact. Yet, even as she preserved these memories, she acknowledged that she had changed irrevocably. The woman she had been could not have endured what she now endured. The endurance itself had reshaped her. She had become more discerning, more patient, more capable of holding contradiction without collapse. These qualities were born of necessity, not choice, but they were real nonetheless. She resisted the temptation to romanticize them. Growth achieved through coercion remained ethically compromised. Still, she allowed herself to recognize the strength she had cultivated even as she mourned the cost. Her husband aged, his confidence settling into routine authority. He relied on her judgment more openly, consulting her on matters of household and family. This reliance did not translate into equality, but it granted her a measure of influence. She used it carefully, advocating for her children, softening harsh decisions, redirecting impulses that might cause harm. In this way, she exercised agency within constraint, shaping outcomes quietly rather than challenging structures openly. She did not mistake this influence for freedom. She understood it as leverage, limited and conditional. The village itself changed slowly. New generations brought new attitudes, though old structures persisted. Traditions were questioned cautiously, sometimes modified, rarely abandoned. She observed these shifts with interest, wondering whether they might one day create space for truths like hers. Yet she also recognized how change often stalled when it threatened foundational assumptions. Her situation, rooted in family honor and marital stability, touched too many pillars at once. It was unlikely to be addressed directly, even in a changing world. As she aged, the intensity of fear diminished, replaced by a steadier awareness of permanence. The lie was no longer fragile. It had become the ground upon which everything stood. This realization brought a strange calm. The energy once spent on anticipation could now be redirected toward meaning-making. She began to reflect on what her life signified beyond its immediate circumstances. What lessons did it hold? What truths did it reveal about the society that had shaped it? She concluded that her life illustrated not the cruelty of individuals, but the efficiency of systems. No single person had set out to destroy her identity. Instead, Many had made reasonable choices within a framework that prioritized order over justice. Each decision, defensible in isolation, contributed to an outcome that no one would publicly claim responsibility for. This diffusion of responsibility was, she realized, one of the system's greatest strengths. It allowed harm to occur without villainy, erasure without acknowledgement. This understanding did not absolve everyone, but it clarified the nature of what she faced. It was not a battle against a single oppressor, but against a network of assumptions reinforced through tradition, language, and convenience. Recognizing this network helped her let go of the hope for dramatic resolution. There would be no moment of revelation that set everything right. There would be no apology sufficient to restore what had been taken. The story would continue as it had begun, quietly, without spectacle. And yet, she refused to believe that her life was meaningless. Meaning, she came to understand, did not depend solely on recognition. It could be constructed through intention, through the choices she made within her limited scope. She found meaning in raising thoughtful children, in practicing compassion where rigidity was expected, in maintaining inner clarity despite external distortion. These acts did not change the system, but they shaped the human experience within it. Her reflections deepened as she considered the future. She imagined her children as adults, navigating their own constraints, making compromises she could not foresee. She hoped they would inherit not her silence, but her awareness. She hoped they would question narratives presented as inevitable, recognize the difference between stability and justice, and seek paths that honored both truth and care. These hopes did not require her truth to be revealed. They required only that she model critical thought and empathy. In this phase of her life, endurance transformed into something closer to witness. She had seen how lives could be rerouted without consent, how systems could absorb sacrifice without acknowledgement. She carried this knowledge not as a burden alone, but as a lens through which she understood the world. This lens sharpened her perception, allowing her to see beneath surfaces, to recognize patterns others accepted without question. It did not make her cynical. It made her attentive. The story of her life, if told at all, would not fit neatly into categories of tragedy or triumph. It resisted simplification. It demanded patience, nuance, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. She accepted that such a story might never be told fully, or at least not in her lifetime. What mattered to her now was that she had not disappeared entirely. She had not surrendered her capacity for reflection, for judgment, for love. These capacities endured, even when her name did not. As the years continued to unfold, she carried forward with a quiet resolve. She would continue to live the life she had been forced into with as much integrity as she could muster. She would continue to protect those who depended on her. She would continue to hold within herself the knowledge of who she was, even if that knowledge remained unspoken. In doing so, she asserted a form of agency that no one had anticipated, a refusal to let the lie define her entirely. This, perhaps, was the most radical aspect of her endurance, not the ability to perform a role indefinitely, but the determination to maintain an inner boundary the role could not cross. Within that boundary, her true self remained present, observant, intact. It did not demand recognition, it demanded only survival. And so the life that had begun with substitution continued, shaped by accommodation and resilience, carrying forward a truth that could not be spoken but also could not be erased. In this continuation lay both the sorrow and the strength of her existence, a testament to the quiet ways people live on when choice has been taken from them, and to the profound cost of systems that confuse stability with justice. As the seasons continued to turn, she noticed that the most exhausting part of her life was no longer the deception itself, but the way it had settled into permanence. What once felt like an emergency had become infrastructure. The lie was no longer something she actively maintained, it was something everything else was built upon. Conversations, relationships, expectations, even memories had aligned themselves around it. Removing it now would not simply reveal truth, it would collapse an entire structure that depended on its existence. This realization forced her to confront a difficult truth about endurance. Endurance, when prolonged, does not remain a conscious act. It becomes identity. She had not merely endured the substitution, she had been reshaped by it. Her reflexes, her instincts, her sense of safety were calibrated around concealment and accommodation. Even in moments when she was alone, truly alone, she found herself thinking in guarded ways, anticipating judgment that was not present, restraining impulses that posed no real risk. Freedom, she discovered, is not easily reclaimed once the mind has learned to live without it. Her days unfolded predictably now, Mornings began with responsibilities, evenings ended in quiet routine. Outsiders would have described her life as stable, even fortunate. She managed her household well, her children were healthy, her husband was respected. There were no scandals attached to her name, no visible suffering. This outward calm became another layer of erasure. Pain that does not announce itself is rarely acknowledged. Suffering that adapts is often mistaken for contentment. She observed how people spoke about her with admiration. They praised her patience, her dedication, her ability to hold everything together. These compliments were meant kindly, but they landed heavily. Each one reinforced the idea that her value lay in her capacity to absorb strain without complaint. No one asked what that strain cost her. No one considered that the qualities they admired were forged under pressure she had not chosen. This dynamic extended beyond her household. In the wider community, women like her were held up as examples of sacrifice, of virtue, of strength. Their stories were told selectively, stripped of context, transformed into moral lessons that encouraged others to accept similar fates. She recognized this pattern clearly. By celebrating endurance without questioning its cause, the system ensured its own continuation. Praise became a tool of control, rewarding compliance while discouraging dissent. Her children, growing older now, began to notice these narratives. They heard stories about strong women who endured hardship for the sake of family and community. They saw how such stories were used to define expectations, particularly for girls. She listened carefully when her children repeated these lessons, testing them, asking questions. In those moments she intervened gently. She affirmed the value of resilience but questioned the inevitability of sacrifice. She spoke about choice, about consent, about the difference between generosity freely given and obligation imposed. These conversations were subtle, framed carefully, but they mattered deeply to her. They were one of the few spaces where she could shape the future more honestly than the past had shaped her. As her children's personalities emerged more fully, she felt a growing sense of urgency. She wanted them to inherit not just stability but awareness. She wanted them to understand that traditions are made by people, and what people make can be unmade or reimagined. She did not tell them her truth, but she equipped them with questions. She taught them to notice who benefits from certain arrangements, whose voices are missing, whose silence is praised. In doing so, she planted seeds of discernment that might one day grow beyond her reach. Her relationship with her husband evolved in complex ways. Years of shared routine had produced familiarity, even reliance. He trusted her judgment in practical matters, deferred to her in decisions involving the children, acknowledged her competence openly. This recognition was real, yet limited. It did not extend to her inner life. He did not see her as someone with a history independent of the role she occupied. His trust was built on the assumption that she was exactly who she appeared to be. The deeper truth remained irrelevant to him, not out of malice, but because the system did not require him to consider it. She wrestled privately with this reality. At times, she wondered whether revealing the truth would even matter now. Would it change how he treated her? Or would it simply be absorbed, rationalized, dismissed as an unfortunate necessity of the past? She suspected the latter. The lie had been normalized too thoroughly. Its exposure might cause momentary shock, but it would not undo years of accommodation. This realization reinforced her understanding that truth, when revealed too late, does not always liberate. Sometimes it merely clarifies how deeply injustice has been embedded. Her own sense of self continued to evolve. The sharp edges of anger she once carried had softened into something more diffuse, less volatile, but more persistent. It was not resignation. It was recognition. Recognition that her life would not include dramatic reversal. Recognition that justice, as commonly imagined, would not arrive. This recognition did not extinguish her desire for dignity. It redirected it inward, toward maintaining coherence between her values and her actions, even when circumstances constrained her options. She found herself increasingly reflective, revisiting moments from her past with new understanding. Events that once felt random or confusing now appeared as part of a pattern. She saw how early lessons about obedience and sacrifice had prepared her for later compliance. She saw how praise for adaptability had conditioned her to accept erasure as virtue. This hindsight was painful, but it was also illuminating. It allowed her to see her life not as a series of personal failures, but as a predictable outcome of social conditioning. This perspective reshaped her relationship with blame. She no longer blamed herself for adapting, nor did she direct blame exclusively outward. Instead, she focused on responsibility, on what she could influence now. She could not rewrite the past, but she could shape the present. She could not dismantle the system, but she could refuse to replicate its most harmful lessons within her own sphere. This focus gave her a sense of purpose that did not depend on recognition. As she aged, physical changes mirrored internal ones. Her body bore the marks of years of labor, childbirth, and restraint. These changes grounded her in reality, reminding her that time was moving forward regardless of unresolved questions. She accepted these changes with a mix of acceptance and grief. Each year that passed confirmed the permanence of her path, even as it brought new forms of authority within her household. Age granted her a degree of respect that youth had denied her. This respect was conditional, but it was real. She used it carefully, advocating for fairness where she could, protecting those with less power, softening rigid expectations. Her interactions with elders shifted as well. Some of those who had made the original decision were gone now, their influence replaced by habit rather than intention. This shift highlighted another uncomfortable truth. Injustice often outlives its architects. Decisions made by specific individuals become traditions upheld by successors who never question their origins. In this way, responsibility becomes diffuse, harder to locate, easier to deny. She recognized that confronting such injustice requires more than exposing individual wrongdoing. It requires interrogating inherited norms. She carried this insight quietly, aware that speaking it aloud would likely be dismissed as bitterness or disruption. Instead, she embodied it through action, through the way she raised her children, the way she treated others, the way she refused to glorify suffering. Her resistance was not loud. It was sustained. It existed in the refusal to romanticize her own endurance, in the insistence that strength born of coercion should not be demanded of others. As her children approached adulthood, she faced new fears. They would soon step into the wider world, encountering the same structures that had shaped her life. She worried about how they would navigate expectations, how much of her caution they would inherit, how much freedom they would claim. She wanted them to be braver than she had been allowed to be, but she also wanted them to be safe. This tension mirrored her own life, balancing truth against consequence, aspiration against reality. In preparing them for this transition, she spoke more openly about complexity. She acknowledged that the world is not fair, that systems often reward conformity over integrity. But she also emphasized that awareness creates choice even within constraint. She encouraged them to seek communities that valued honesty, to question narratives that demanded silence, to recognize when sacrifice was being demanded unfairly. These lessons were her legacy, offered without revealing the full story behind them. Her own legacy, she knew, would not be recorded publicly. There would be no acknowledgement of what she had given up, no recognition of the life she had been forced to abandon. Yet she also knew that legacy is not limited to record. It lives in influence, in values transmitted, in patterns disrupted quietly. If her children carried forward a more critical awareness, if they resisted replicate the injustices she had endured, then her endurance would not have been meaningless. As this stage of her life unfolded, she came to terms with a final difficult truth. Her story would likely remain untold, at least in its entirety, not because it lacked significance, but because it challenged too many comfortable assumptions. Stories like hers are inconvenient. They expose how ordinary decisions can produce extraordinary harm. They complicate narratives of tradition, honor, and stability. They ask uncomfortable questions about consent and agency. Such stories are easier to bury than to confront. Accepting this reality did not mean accepting silence as virtue. It meant recognizing the limits of what could be changed from within her position. She did not confuse acceptance with approval. She understood the difference clearly. Her acceptance was pragmatic, not moral. It allowed her to conserve energy for what mattered most, protecting her children, preserving her sense of self, and maintaining clarity about the injustice she had experienced. In the quiet moments that punctuated her days, she reflected on the meaning of her endurance. Endurance, she realized, is often misunderstood. It is not passive. It is not simple. It is an active process of negotiation, adaptation, and restraint. It requires intelligence, foresight, and emotional discipline. Yet because it does not disrupt outward order, it is rarely recognized as labor. Her life had been shaped by this unrecognized labor, and she understood that many others live similar lives unseen and unacknowledged. This understanding connected her to a broader, silent community, those whose lives had been redirected without consent, whose sacrifice had been normalized, whose strength had been praised without questioning its cause. She carried their stories with her, even if she did not know their names. In this sense, her endurance was not isolated. It was part of a larger pattern, one that spanned generations and cultures. As she moved forward, she did so with a steady resolve. She would continue to live within the constraints imposed upon her, but she would not allow those constraints to define the entirety of her being. She would continue to question, to reflect, to teach awareness where she could. She would refuse to let her silence be mistaken for agreement. And in that refusal, quiet and persistent, lay the truest expression of her agency, not in escape, not in exposure, but in the determination to live with integrity inside a life she had not chosen, and to ensure that the cost of such lives did not go entirely unseen, even if it was never spoken aloud. As the shape of her life hardened into something that could no longer be bent without breaking, she found that time itself began to feel different. It no longer rushed forward with the urgency of crisis, nor did it stretch endlessly as it had in the early years of adjustment. Instead, it settled into a slow, deliberate procession, marked by routine and responsibilities that repeated with reassuring regularity. This steadiness was both comfort and constraint. It dulled the sharpest edges of fear, but it also confirmed that the path ahead would look much like the path behind, uninterrupted by revelation or release. Her children, now no longer small, occupied much of her attention. Their growth brought with it a new kind of vigilance, one focused less on concealment and more on guidance. She watched them carefully, not for signs of danger, but for signs of curiosity, questions forming, assumptions being tested, identities beginning to take shape. In their emerging independence, she saw both hope and risk. Hope that they might navigate the world with greater freedom than she had known. Risk that the same structures which had constrained her would reach for them as well, subtle and persistent. She became increasingly intentional about how she spoke to them. Conversations that once revolved around obedience and propriety now included discussions of fairness, of responsibility, of the difference between rules that protect and rules that control. She did not frame these lessons as rebellion. She framed them as awareness. She wanted her children to understand that tradition is not inherently sacred, that it gains meaning only through its impact on those who live under it. This approach required care. Too much questioning could invite conflict. Too little would perpetuate silence. She walked this line with the same practiced balance that had sustained her for years. Within the household, her authority had grown quietly. Age and experience conferred a respect that youth had denied her. Servants deferred to her judgment. Relatives sought her advice. Her husband relied on her competence openly now, trusting her to manage affairs he no longer wished to oversee. This reliance did not grant her equality, but it did grant her influence. Influence, she understood, was not freedom, but it could be leveraged. She used it to soften decisions, to protect the vulnerable, to redirect rigid expectations toward more humane outcomes. This subtle exercise of power brought a complicated satisfaction. It reminded her that she was not merely a passive recipient of circumstance. She could shape the environment around her even if she could not reshape its foundation. Yet this satisfaction was always tempered by awareness. Every act of influence took place within a structure that remained fundamentally unchanged. Her authority was conditional, dependent on her continued conformity. It could be withdrawn as easily as it had been granted. As she reflected on this dynamic, she recognized how deeply her life illustrated the difference between agency and autonomy. Agency allowed her to act within limits, to make choices that mattered locally. Autonomy, the freedom to define the terms of one's own existence, had been denied to her long ago. This distinction clarified much of her experience. It explained why she could feel effective without feeling free, competent without feeling whole. Understanding this difference did not resolve the tension, but it gave it language. Her internal world continued to evolve alongside these realizations. The anger she had once carried had transformed again, thinning into something closer to sorrow, though not despair. It was the sorrow of recognizing what could have been, of understanding the magnitude of what had been taken without the possibility of restoration. This sorrow was quiet and enduring. It surfaced unexpectedly, in moments of reflection or during encounters that echoed her past. She learned to sit with it, neither indulging nor suppressing it, allowing it to exist without dictating her actions. She found herself increasingly drawn to moments of solitude, not because she wished to escape her responsibilities, but because solitude allowed her to think without calculation. Alone, she did not need to anticipate reactions or manage impressions. She could allow thoughts to unfold fully, exploring questions that had no safe place in conversation. These moments became essential to her sense of self, offering a space where authenticity could exist without consequence. In these solitary reflections, she considered the possibility of telling her story someday, perhaps not to those around her, but to someone who might carry it beyond the confines of her immediate world. She imagined writing it down, preserving it in words that could outlast her. The idea tempted her, but it also frightened her. Words, once released, cannot be controlled. They can be misunderstood, misused, or ignored. She weighed the desire to be witnessed against the risk of harm that exposure might bring, not only to herself but to her children. The calculation always ended the same way. Silence, for now, remained the safer choice. Yet silence did not mean forgetting. On the contrary, she remembered with increasing clarity. Memory became a form of resistance, a refusal to allow her past to be overwritten entirely. She revisited scenes from her youth, replaying them in detail, anchoring them in her mind. She remembered the sound of her sister's laughter before everything changed, the texture of the rooms they had shared, the sense of possibility that once felt natural. These memories did not weaken her resolve, they strengthened it, reminding her of the life that had existed before substitution became destiny. Her sister's life remained largely separate from her own, intersecting only occasionally through indirect news. She learned of milestones secondhand, delivered without emotion, as if they belonged to someone only tangentially connected. Each update stirred a familiar mix of relief and sadness. Relief that her sacrifice had indeed purchased freedom for another. Sadness that this freedom had been bought at such a cost, one that no one publicly acknowledged. She did not regret protecting her sister. What she regretted was the absence of accountability, the way the burden had been placed on her without recognition or choice. This regret deepened her understanding of injustice as something that thrives in invisibility. When harm is visible, it can be contested. When it is hidden behind normalcy, it becomes harder to name, let alone challenge. Her life, outwardly unremarkable, concealed a history of coercion that few would suspect. This concealment was not accidental. It was the mechanism by which the system preserved itself. Recognizing this mechanism allowed her to see similar patterns elsewhere in other families, other communities, other traditions. Her story was not unique. It was exemplary. This recognition altered how she listened to others. She became attentive to what was not said, to hesitations and deflections, to the quiet accommodations people made without naming them. She learned to hear suffering in stories framed as duty, to detect loss in narratives of sacrifice. This sensitivity did not make her cynical. It made her compassionate. She understood that many people live lives shaped by constraints they did not choose, navigating them with whatever tools they have available. Her compassion extended to herself, though this was perhaps the hardest lesson to learn. For years she had judged her own compliance harshly, measuring it against ideals of courage and honesty that ignored context. Over time she came to see her choices more generously. She recognized that survival is not a failure of principle, but a response to reality. She had done what was necessary to protect herself and those she loved, even when the cost was high. This self-compassion did not erase pain, but it softened its edges, allowing her to live without constant self-reproach. As her children approached adulthood, the household dynamic shifted again. Responsibilities were redistributed. Authority began to pass gradually to the next generation. This transition brought both relief and anxiety. Relief that some of the burden she had carried might finally ease. Anxiety about how much control she would relinquish and what that loss of control might expose. She watched carefully as her children made choices, noting where they aligned with tradition and where they diverged. Each divergence felt like a small victory, even when it brought tension. She also began to prepare herself for a future in which her central role would diminish. This prospect was bittersweet. On one hand, it promised rest, a release from constant management. On the other, it threatened the fragile equilibrium she had maintained for so long. Her authority had been a shield, however imperfect. Without it, she would be more vulnerable to reinterpretation, to dismissal, to erasure. She contemplated how she would navigate this new phase, drawing on the resilience she had cultivated over decades. Throughout these changes, her husband's presence shifted from partnership to habit. They shared history, children, routine, but not intimacy in the deeper sense. Their relationship was functional, stable, and emotionally restrained. She accepted this reality without bitterness. It would in many ways the natural outcome of a union built on substitution rather than choice. She did not mourn what she had never truly had. She focused instead on maintaining civility and mutual respect, recognizing that this too was a form of stability. Her understanding of stability, however, had evolved. She no longer equated it with goodness. Stability could coexist with injustice. It could even depend on it. This understanding made her cautious about accepting stability as an unquestioned ideal. She taught her children to value balance, but also to recognize when balance was achieved through unequal distribution of burden. These lessons were subtle, woven into everyday conversations, but they reflected a deep commitment to fairness that she hoped would endure beyond her influence. As the years accumulated, she sensed that her life was entering its later chapters. This awareness prompted a different kind of reflection, less focused on endurance, more on meaning. What, she asked herself, would remain of her when her active role diminished? What traces of her existence would persist? She knew the answer would not be found in public recognition or recorded history. It would be found in the values she had transmitted, the small shifts she had influenced, the questions she had encouraged others to ask. She accepted that her story might never be told in full, but she took comfort in the possibility that parts of it would echo indirectly in her children, skepticism toward unjust traditions, in their insistence on consent where she had been denied it, in their willingness to imagine alternatives. These echoes mattered to her more than acknowledgement. They represented continuity without replication, progress without erasure. Her inner life, though shaped by loss, remained active and engaged. She continued to think deeply, to analyze patterns, to reflect on the world around her. These habits sustained her, offering a sense of purpose that did not depend on external validation. She had learned long ago that meaning must often be constructed from within, particularly when circumstances restrict outward expression. As she moved forward, she did so with a quiet acceptance of ambiguity. Her life did not fit neatly into categories of victimhood or heroism. It contained elements of both, along with long stretches of ordinary endurance. She no longer sought to resolve this complexity. She embraced it as truth. Truth, she had learned, is rarely simple and almost never convenient. In the end, what defined this phase of her life was not resignation, but clarity. Clarity about the forces that had shaped her, about the choices she had made within constraint, about the legacy she hoped to leave. This clarity did not bring liberation, but it brought peace of a certain kind, the peace of understanding, of naming reality accurately even when it cannot be changed. And so she continued day by day, carrying forward a life built on substitution but sustained by intention. She lived not as the woman she had been meant to be, nor entirely as the woman she was required to become, but as someone in between, navigating the space left behind by unasked questions and unacknowledged sacrifices. In that space, she forged a quiet dignity, one that did not demand recognition but deserved it nonetheless. As the years stretched onward, she became increasingly aware that the most profound shift in her life was not marked by any single event, but by a gradual recalibration of how she understood herself in relation to time. The future, once imagined as a distant horizon of possibility, had narrowed into something quieter and more immediate. It was no longer a space for reinvention or escape, but a continuation of patterns already set in motion. This realization did not arrive with despair. It arrived with sobriety. She began to live less in anticipation and more in observation, attentive to the present as it unfolded, accepting that her influence now lay not in changing the shape of her life, but in shaping the meaning drawn from it. Her children, as transitions into adulthood, made this awareness unavoidable. One by one, they stepped beyond the boundaries of the household, carrying with them values she had carefully cultivated and questions she had deliberately encouraged. Watching them navigate the world stirred a complicated blend of pride and fear. Pride in their independence, their willingness to question, their refusal to accept answers simply because they were customary. Fear that the same forces that had constrained her would reach for them as well, subtle and persuasive, cloaked in the language of responsibility and tradition. She knew she could not protect them indefinitely. What she could offer was discernment, the ability to recognize when expectations were being imposed without consent. As they left, the house grew quieter. The routines that had once revolved around their needs loosened, creating spaces she had not experienced in decades. These spaces felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous, because they demanded a reorientation of purpose. For so long, her identity had been anchored in care and management, in anticipating others' needs and shielding them from harm. With those roles receding, she faced the question she had avoided for years. Who was she when no one was watching? No one was depending on her constant vigilance. At first, this question unsettled her. Without the familiar weight of responsibility, she felt exposed, as if the structures that had constrained her also protected her from confronting loss directly. But over time, she began to explore this quieter phase with cautious curiosity. She allowed herself longer moments of reflection, unstructured time where thoughts could wander without immediate purpose. In these moments, she revisited aspects of herself that had been dormant, interests set aside, curiosities suppressed, ways of thinking that had once brought her joy. She did not mistake this exploration for freedom. The constraints of her life remained. But within those constraints, she discovered pockets of agency she had not previously recognized. She chose how to spend her time, which conversations to pursue, which silences to maintain. These choices were small, but they mattered. They allowed her to reassert authorship over her inner life, even as the outer narrative remained unchanged. Her relationship with her husband shifted again during this period. With the children gone, the nature of their coexistence became more apparent. They shared history, but not intimacy, familiarity, but not deep understanding. This truth, once obscured by constant activity, now stood plainly between them. She did not feel anger about this. Instead, she felt a quiet clarity. Their bond had always been defined by circumstance rather than choice. Expecting it to transform into something else now felt unnecessary. She focused instead on maintaining civility and mutual respect, recognizing that this, too, was a form of stability she had helped build. Outside the household, she noticed changes in the community that reflected broader shifts in the world. Younger generations spoke differently about obligation and choice. Some traditions were questioned openly, others adapted quietly. These changes did not dismantle the structures that had shaped her life, but they created cracks, small openings through which new ideas could pass. She observed these developments with cautious hope, aware that progress often arrives unevenly, benefiting some while leaving others behind. Still, the very act of questioning felt significant. It suggested that silence was no longer the only acceptable response. In conversations with younger women, she found herself listening more than speaking, offering guidance only when asked. She recognized in their uncertainties echoes of her own past, though their circumstances differed. When they spoke of expectations placed upon them, of choices constrained by family or community, she did not offer platitudes. She asked questions instead. What do you want? Who benefits from this arrangement? What would happen if you said no? These questions did not provide immediate solutions, but they encouraged reflection. Reflection, she believed, was the first step toward agency. Her own story remained largely untold even in these exchanges. She sensed that revealing it now would serve little purpose. It might elicit sympathy, perhaps admiration, that it would not change the past or significantly alter the present. More importantly, she feared that her story could be misinterpreted as evidence that endurance was admirable rather than necessary, that silence was noble rather than coerced. She did not want her life to be used as justification for perpetuating the same conditions that had constrained her. Instead, she allowed her experience to inform her perspective quietly. It shaped how she listened, how she responded, how she evaluated claims about duty and sacrifice. This influence was subtle but real. It did not announce itself, but it altered the tone of conversations, the framing of questions, the assumptions left unchallenged. In this way, her endurance transformed into something generative, not because it had been just, but because it had produced understanding. As her sense of urgency diminished, replaced by a steadier acceptance, she found that memory itself began to shift. Painful recollections lost some of their sharpness, not because they were forgotten, but because they were integrated into a broader narrative. She no longer revisited them with the same intensity. Instead, she understood them as part of a continuum, experiences that had shaped her without defining her entirely. This integration allowed her to move forward without constantly measuring the present against the past. she also became more forgiving of the complexities in others. The people who had participated in the decision that altered her life were no longer present, either physically or in influence. Judging them now felt less important than understanding the system that had made their actions seem reasonable. This shift did not absolve harm, but it redirected attention toward prevention rather than blame. She cared less about assigning fault and more about disrupting patterns. Her inner dialogue grew quieter, less dominated by hypothetical scenarios and unresolved questions. This quiet was not emptiness. It was spaciousness. It allowed her to engage with the world more gently, to appreciate moments of beauty without immediately calculating their cost. A walk at dusk, a conversation that wandered freely, a shared laugh, these experiences, once rare, became sources of quiet sustenance. They did not compensate for what she had lost, but they enriched what remained. As she aged, her physical strength waned, but her clarity deepened. She recognized that her life, though constrained, had been lived with intention wherever possible. She had protected her children, cultivated awareness, resisted internalizing false narratives about her worth. These achievements were not visible to the world, but they mattered deeply to her. They represented a form of success measured not by recognition, but by coherence between values and action. She reflected often on the idea of legacy. Legacy, she realized, is frequently misunderstood as something grand or public. In truth, it is often quiet, carried forward in attitudes and choices rather than names and monuments. Her legacy would not be recorded in official histories, but it would live on in the questions her children asked, the skepticism they brought to inherited norms, in the compassion they extended to others navigating constraint. This understanding brought her a sense of fulfillment that recognition never could have provided. In moments of solitude, she imagined a future where stories like hers were no longer exceptional, not because they were common, but because the conditions that produced them had been dismantled. She imagined a world where substitution without consent was recognized as injustice, not tradition, where stability was not purchased at the cost of individual truth. She knew she would not live to see such a world, if it came at all. But imagining it mattered. It affirmed that her suffering was not inevitable, that it belonged to a particular historical and cultural context rather than to human nature itself. This imagination did not lead her to bitterness. It led her to a quiet form of hope, grounded not in expectation but in possibility. Possibility, she understood, does not guarantee change. It simply keeps the future from closing entirely. Her life had taught her the importance of preserving that openness, even when circumstances seemed fixed. As she moved deeper in this final phase, she accepted that her story would likely remain fragmented, known only in pieces by those who had lived near it. She no longer felt the need for it to be whole or publicly acknowledged. Wholeness, she had learned, is not dependent on external validation. It is achieved through internal alignment, through living in a way that honors one as understanding of truth, even when that truth cannot be spoken. She continued to live quietly, attentive to the world around her, engaged without being consumed. The woman she had been before the substitution felt distant, but not erased. The woman she had become felt real, shaped by endurance and insight. She existed between these identities, not fully belonging to either, yet drawing strength from both. In this in-between space, she found a form of peace, not the peace of resolution, but the peace of acceptance without surrender. She did not accept the injustice as right. She accepted that it had happened, and that her response to it was the only part she could claim as her own. That response, shaped by care, reflection, and restraint, defined her more truthfully than any name she had been forced to carry. And so, her life continued without spectacle. She carried forward with quiet dignity, a witness to the cost of silence and the resilience it demands. Her story, though rarely spoken, lived on in the spaces between words, in the questions left unanswered. In the subtle ways she had taught others to look more closely at what is presented as normal. In that looking lay the possibility of change, however distant, and in that possibility she allowed herself to rest. As the final stretch of her life unfolded, she became acutely aware that endings rarely arrive with clear boundaries. There was no final chapter announced, no moment where everything she had carried resolved into clarity. Instead, life continued in the same quiet manner it always had, through ordinary days, familiar rooms, and routines that no longer demanded explanation. What changed was not the structure of her life, but her relationship to it. She no longer lived in tension with the question of what might have been revealed or undone. That question had exhausted itself. In its place settled a deeper, steadier awareness of what had been lived, endured, and preserved. Her body now reflected the passage of time unmistakably. Movement slowed. Energy came in shorter waves. These changes, once feared, felt almost merciful. They granted her permission to rest in ways she had never allowed herself before. She delegated more, spoke less, observed more. In this quieter rhythm, reflection came naturally, not as a deliberate act, but as a constant companion. Memory drifted in and out of focus, sometimes sharp, sometimes softened by distance. She welcomed both states. Sharp memories reminded her of who she had been. Softened ones allowed her to live without reopening wounds that no longer needed to bleed to be acknowledged. Her children returned occasionally, now as visitors rather than dependents. Each visit reassured her that they had survived the transition into the wider world, carrying with them the discernment she had hoped to instill. They spoke openly about their lives, their struggles, their doubts. They asked for advice but not instruction. They did not seek permission to live differently. This distinction mattered deeply to her. It confirmed that while her life had been shaped by constraint, theirs did not have to be defined by the same silence. She listened to them carefully, offering perspective without imposing her own regrets. She did not warn them against love, marriage, or commitment. She warned them only against unexamined obligation. She reminded them gently that consent is not a formality but a foundation. That stability built without it may endure, but it always extracts a cost. These lessons, delivered without confession, carried the weight of lived experience. She trusted that they would be understood in time. Her husband's presence during these years became more subdued, less central. Age had softened him as well, stripping away some of the certainty that once defined his authority. They shared space comfortably, if not intimately. There were moments of shared silence that felt companionable rather than strained. She did not reinterpret their relationship in retrospect. She allowed it to remain what it had been, neither romanticized nor condemned. It was, like much of her life, a result of circumstance rather than choice. Accepting this allowed her to release lingering questions that no longer served her. The community around her continued to change in small, uneven ways. New customs emerged, old ones faded. Some of the rigid expectations that had once seemed immovable loosened, though never entirely disappeared. She observed these changes without resentment. Progress, she knew, rarely arrives in time for those most harmed by the past. It arrives late, benefiting those who come after. This knowledge did not embitter her. It grounded her. It allowed her to take satisfaction in the fact that her endurance, however unjustly demanded, existed within a larger historical arc that could still bend. As she reflected on that arc, she recognized that her story, though deeply personal, was also emblematic. It illustrated how lives can be redirected quietly, without force or spectacle, through appeals to duty, honor, and necessity. It showed how systems rely not only on coercion, but on the willingness of individuals to absorb harm for the sake of continuity. Understanding this did not reduce her life to an example. It contextualized it. It placed her experience within a broader pattern that transcended individual blame. In her final reflections, she returned often to the concept of naming. Names, she realized, carry power not only because they identify, but because they affirm existence. To be named correctly is to be recognized as oneself. She had lived most of her life under a borrowed name, one that had facilitated order at the expense of truth. Yet despite this, she had never entirely lost her sense of who she was. That self had existed without public acknowledgement, sustained through memory, reflection, and quiet resistance. This survival, she understood, was itself a form of defiance. She no longer wished for her name to be restored publicly. That desire had belonged to an earlier version of herself, one still hoping for correction. Now, she sought something different, not restoration, but understanding. She wanted her life to be seen not as a tale of noble sacrifice, but as a cautionary account of what happens when stability is valued more than consent. If her story were ever told, she hoped it would be told honestly, without embellishment or moral simplification. In moments of solitude, she imagined a listener, someone distant in time or place, who might hear such a story and pause before accepting tradition as inevitable, Pause before praising endurance without asking what made it necessary. Pause before assuming that silence implies agreement. These imagined pauses gave her a sense of continuity beyond her immediate world. They suggested that even untold stories exert influence, shaping the moral imagination in ways that are not always visible. Her sense of peace, when it came, was not rooted in satisfaction, but in coherence. Her inner life felt aligned at last, not because circumstances had changed, but because she had stopped measuring her worth against outcomes she could never control. She measured it instead by intention, by the care she had shown, by the awareness she had cultivated and passed on. This shift allowed her to rest without resentment, to accept her life as it was without endorsing the injustice that had shaped it. As her days grew shorter, she spent more time simply observing light, moving across a room, the sound of distant voices, the quiet persistence of routine. These moments grounded her in the present, free from the burden of explanation. She did not feel the need to summarize her life, to draw conclusions or extract lessons. Life, she understood, is not a narrative that resolves neatly. It is a sequence of adaptations, some chosen, others imposed, all leaving their mark. And yet, if one thread ran consistently through her existence, it was this: she had never allowed the lie that defined her public life to become the truth of her inner one. That boundary, maintained quietly and at great cost, had preserved her humanity. It allowed her to love without illusion, to think without constraint, to recognize injustice without internalizing it as fate. This boundary, more than anything else, was her achievement. In the end, her story did not conclude with revelation or escape. It concluded with endurance transformed into witness, silence transformed into understanding. She left behind no confession, no written account, no public reckoning. What she left behind were people shaped by her discernment, conversations altered by her questions, assumptions softened by her presence. These traces were subtle, but they were real. And perhaps that is how many such stories end, not with justice delivered, but with awareness seeded. Awareness that grows quietly, passed from one mind to another, challenging what once seemed immutable. Awareness that reminds us that behind every stable arrangement may lie unspoken cost, and behind every praised sacrifice may stand a life redirected without consent. If this story stayed with you, if it made you uncomfortable, reflective, or quietly unsettled, then take a moment now to subscribe to the Black Timeline. Tap the bell icon so you never miss the stories history prefers to keep silent. And leave a comment, sharing how deeply this story affected you. Because stories like this are not meant to be consumed and forgotten. They are meant to be carried forward, examined and remembered. Not all chains are visible. Not all prisons have walls. And not all courage announces itself. Sometimes courage looks like living an entire life inside a truth that cannot be spoken, and refusing even then to let that truth disappear.